Jonah Cole laid down his cards without blinking, not because he wanted the pot, but because what sat across that table wasn't money. It was a woman, trembling, eyes cast down, treated like a deed to a piece of land nobody wanted. Something locked inside his chest and refused to let go. He didn't think. He called. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow every part until the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Dust Devil Saloon had a way of swallowing people whole. It wasn't the whiskey. It wasn't the gambling. It was the way men looked at each other across those tables, like the whole world could be reduced to a hand of cards and whatever sat in the middle of the pot. On a Tuesday evening in late July, the heat hadn't broken by sundown. It never did in Caldwell, Kansas. The air inside the saloon pressed against every man in the room like a wool blanket soaked through, and the coal oil lamps made the whole place shimmer orange and mean. Jonah Cole sat at the far corner table with his back to the wall. That wasn't habit. That was survival. 11 years riding this territory had taught him more about human nature than any preacher or schoolbook ever could. And the first lesson was always the same: know what's behind you. He had a decent hand. Not great. Not the kind of hand that made a man's pulse quicken. But Jonah Cole had never played cards for the thrill. He played them to read men, to see what they were willing to risk, what they were willing to lose, and most importantly, what they were willing to do when they were losing. Silas Stone was losing. Silas wasn't a large man, not in the way that commanded rooms. He was narrow through the shoulder and wide through the mouth, with a jaw that moved constantly chewing on something that wasn't there. He had the eyes of a man who'd spent a lifetime deciding what other people were worth. Quick calculating, always tallying. He'd won 4 hands already tonight. Big ones. The kind of wins that made other men slide their chairs back from the table and decide they'd had enough. But Silas Stone never had enough. And now he was sitting on a pile of losses that had eaten through his cash, through his promissory notes, through the deed to a mule and a strip of creek land on the edge of town. And still he hadn't moved. "I raise," Silas said. The table went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from respect. The kind that comes from everyone sensing something wrong in the air, the same instinct that makes horses go still before a storm. Hank Mueller, the barkeep's son, shifted in his chair. Old Pete Dawson stared at his cards without seeing them. The fourth man at the table, a cattle drover named Russ, who'd only sat down an hour ago, set his hand face down and said, "I'm out," in a voice that was almost apologetic. Because what Silas Stone had just pushed to the center of the table wasn't money. It was a folded piece of paper, creased and sweat-stained at the edges, and beside it, a brass key on a short length of rope. Jonah didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. He could read what it was from across the table. He'd seen enough documents in enough courtrooms and land offices to recognize the shape of legal language, even when the words were turned away from him. "What is that?" he said. It wasn't a question. It was a door he was opening slowly, giving Silas the chance to walk back through it. Silas didn't take the chance. "That," Silas said, tapping the paper with one finger, "is a bill of ownership, legal and notarized. Girl came with a debt her family couldn't pay." He paused. Let that settle into the room. "She's been working it off for 14 months. Got maybe 8 more to go before she's square. But I figure tonight's winnings ought to cover the balance." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Whoever holds that paper holds her contract." Jonah Cole did not move. His jaw did not tighten. His hands stayed flat on the table. But something in the room shifted the way it shifts when a man who has been very still decides he is done being still. "You're putting a woman in this pot," Jonah said. "I'm putting a contract in this pot," Silas corrected pleasantly. "Perfectly legal instrument. Her people signed it themselves." "Her people," Jonah repeated. "Her family. Owed money they couldn't repay. This was the arrangement." Silas spread his hands, the picture of reasonableness. "It's business, Cole. You understand business." Jonah understood business. He also understood what he was looking at. Across the saloon, not at the bar, not at the gaming tables, but pressed into a narrow space between the back wall and a broken piano. Nobody played anymore. Stood a woman he hadn't let himself look at directly since he'd walked in. She was American. A full-figured woman, heavy-set in the way that spoke of hard work and not enough care, with dark hair pinned back from a face that had gotten very good at going somewhere else while her body stayed put. She wore a gray dress that was clean, but too warm for July, and she stood with her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes on the floor. She wasn't looking at the table. She had stopped looking at things that were being decided about her. That much was clear. Her name was Abigail Turner. Jonah would learn that later. In this moment, he knew only what he could see, and what he could see was a woman who had learned to make herself small in a room full of men who'd been making decisions about her life for over a year. Jonah looked back at Silas Stone. "I call," he said. Silas turned his cards over slowly. He had a full house kings over nines. It was a strong hand, the kind of hand that wins most nights. The kind of hand that Silas had probably been counting on since he'd decided to put that contract in the pot. Jonah laid his cards down without ceremony. 4 jacks. The silence that followed was different from the first kind. This one had weight in it. Silas stared at the cards for a long moment. Then he looked up at Jonah, and for the first time his calculating eyes found something they couldn't calculate. "Well," he said. He picked up his whiskey glass, found it empty, set it back down. "Well." "The paper," Jonah said. Silas pushed it across the table, then the key. Jonah took both without looking at them. He folded the paper once and put it in his breast pocket. He slipped the key into his vest. Then he stood up from the table, touched the brim of his hat, and walked toward the back of the saloon. Every eye in the room followed him. He stopped a few feet from the woman, close enough to speak quietly, far enough that she wasn't pressed. She didn't look up. "Ma'am," he said. "Nothing. My name is Jonah Cole. I have a ranch about 12 miles north of here. I'm riding out tonight." He paused. "You're welcome to come, or you're welcome to go wherever you choose. Either way, this paper is yours." He held out the folded document. For the first time, she looked up. Her eyes were brown, darker than he'd expected, and steadier. Steadier than most people's eyes got after 14 months of what she'd been through. There was something in them he couldn't name right away. Not fear exactly. Not hope. Something older than both. The look of a person who has been offered things before and learned not to trust the offering. She did not take the paper. "You won me," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it wasn't small. "In a card game, I won a contract," Jonah said, "which I'm handing back to you. It's your life. I don't have any use for it." She studied him the way a person studies ground before they put weight on it. "Why?" she said. It was the right question. Jonah had known it was coming, and he'd been honest with himself on the walk over that he didn't have a clean answer to it. He had a ranch that was running short on hands. He had a house that had been too quiet for 2 years. He had a reason that was practical and a reason that was something else, and he wasn't ready to sort out which was which. "Because nobody ought to be in a pot," he said finally. "Come or don't. But take the paper either way." She took it. She looked down at it in her hands. This document that had governed her life for 14 months, that had dictated where she slept and when she ate, and what work she did from sunup to black dark. She held it for a moment. Then she folded it in half again and pushed it into the pocket of her dress. "I'll come," she said. "For now." Jonah nodded. "Wagon's out front. Take your time." He turned and walked back through the saloon without looking at any of the men watching him. At the bar, he set down enough coin to cover the round he'd bought earlier, and a little more. He didn't look at Silas Stone. Outside, the night air was still hot but cleaner. Crickets were working hard in the dry grass along the road. Jonah untied his horse from the post, checked the wagon hitching, and waited. She came out about 3 minutes later. She had a cloth bag over one arm, everything she owned apparently, which wasn't much. She stopped at the edge of the boardwalk and looked at the wagon. You want help up? He asked. I can manage, she said. She could. She climbed up with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been doing physical work their whole life and didn't need anyone to make a production of it. She settled onto the bench seat and looked straight ahead. Jonah climbed up on his side. He clicked to the horse. The wagon pulled out of Caldwell, Kansas, heading north under a sky full of stars that didn't care about any of it. They didn't speak for the first 2 miles. Jonah was comfortable with silence. He'd spent enough of his life in it to know that silence wasn't emptiness, it was just space where things could settle. Some men were afraid of it. Silas Stone was afraid of it. Men who needed to fill every room with noise were usually men who didn't want to hear themselves think. The woman beside him didn't seem afraid of it either, which told him something. At the 2-mile mark she spoke. "What do you grow?" she asked. "Cattle mostly, some horses, small garden plot for the house." "Hands." "Had 3, down to 1 now. My foreman Webb. Good man." She nodded. "Turn this over." "What do you need done?" she asked. It wasn't a soft question. It wasn't gratitude or pleasantry. It was the question of someone trying to understand their situation in practical terms. What is expected? What can I manage? What is this arrangement going to look like? Jonah respected that. "Right now, nothing," he said. "You can get settled. Figure out what you want." She turned and looked at him directly for the first time since they'd left the saloon. The moonlight was enough to see by barely. "Mr. Cole," she said, "I understand what this looks like. I understand you have that paper, whatever you say about it. I've been in arrangements before where the terms weren't what they appeared to be up front." "I understand that," Jonah said. "So I'm going to be straightforward with you. I can cook, I can clean. I know gardens, and I know livestock basics. I can keep books if you have them. I will work honestly for honest treatment." She paused. "But I am not a possession. I don't care what any paper says." Jonah kept his eyes on the road. "No argument from me," he said. She watched him for another moment. Then she turned back to face forward. "Abigail," she said. "My name is Abigail Turner." "Jonah Cole?" "I know." They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the first 2 miles. Less careful, less loaded. The kind of silence where 2 people have said the necessary things and can rest a moment before the rest of it starts. The ranch came into view just after midnight. It was bigger than she'd expected. Not grand, nothing about it was trying to be grand. But it was solid. The main house was 2 stories of rough-cut timber with a porch running the full front length. The barn was newer looking than the house. The fences were maintained. There were 3 horses visible in the near paddock, standing quiet in the dark. "Webb!" Jonah called out as they pulled in. A light moved in the bunkhouse. A door opened. A man in his 50s appeared carrying a lantern, moving with the deliberate ease of someone who'd been awake anyway. He was a tall, lean man, with a gray beard and the permanently squinted eyes of someone who'd spent decades reading weather and cattle and distance. He took in the wagon, took in Jonah, took in Abigail, and didn't say anything for a moment. "Webb, this is Miss Turner. She'll be staying in the main house. Get the lamp lit in the guest room if you don't mind." Webb looked at Abigail, not sizing her up the way men at the saloon had, more the way a man looks at something unexpected that he's deciding how to feel about. "Miss Turner," he said, touching his hat brim. "Webb Daniels. You need anything, you just say." "Thank you," she said. Her voice had some warmth in it for the first time. Webb headed to the house. Jonah climbed down from the wagon and moved to the horse's head. He didn't offer his hand to help her down this time. She'd made that clear. She climbed down herself. She stood for a moment in the yard looking at the house. "It's a real place," she said, quietly, more to herself than to him. "It's a real place," Jonah agreed. She followed him inside. The room they gave her was small, but it had a real window with a cotton curtain and a proper bed with a quilt on it. There was a washstand with clean water. There was a hook on the wall for her bag. Webb had lit the lamp on the bedside table and left without ceremony. Abigail set her bag down. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the quilt. It was old, the kind of old where you could see the labor in it, the tiny stitches, the careful piecing. Someone had made it with time and intention. She sat on the edge of the bed. For 14 months, she had slept in a storage room off the kitchen at the Dust Devil, on a cot, with a single thin blanket, summer and winter. She had eaten what was left after service. She had worked from 5 in the morning until whenever Silas Stone decided the last customer had gone home. She put her hand on the quilt. Outside her door, she heard Jonah Cole's footsteps moving down the hall and then down the stairs. No pause, no listening at her door, just the ordinary sounds of a man going about his house at the end of the day. She lay down on top of the quilt, still dressed, and looked at the ceiling. She didn't sleep for a long time, but she didn't cry either. She hadn't cried in a long time. She'd run out of tears somewhere around month 3 and never quite found them again. What she did instead was think. She thought about the card game, about a man she'd never seen before standing up from a poker table and crossing a saloon and telling her she could go wherever she chose. About the way he'd held out that paper without asking for anything in return. About the way he'd said, "It's your life," like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She thought about what she'd said to him in the wagon. "I am not a possession." And she thought about the fact that he'd said no argument from me without hesitation, without offense, without the careful smile men used when they were humoring someone they didn't intend to listen to. She didn't know what to make of Jonah Cole yet. She'd learned not to make things out too fast. But she knew this much. The room was real. The quilt was real. And for the first time in 14 months, no one had locked her door. Morning came fast in Kansas in July. The heat arrived before the light did, pressing through the window curtain before the sun had fully shown itself. Abigail was up before it. Old habit, and one she didn't try to fight. She washed her face at the stand, changed into her other dress, the better one, dark blue, worn, but not frayed, and went downstairs. The kitchen was empty, but the stove had already been stoked. Someone had been up before her. She found coffee ready and a side of salt pork on the counter, and she stood for a moment looking at it, trying to figure out the protocol. Then she heard boots on the porch. Jonah came through the back door with his hat pushed back and his sleeves already rolled to the elbow. He pulled up short when he saw her standing in the kitchen. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she nodded at the stove. "I can cook if you're not set on doing it yourself. Webb usually handles it." "Webb doesn't have to," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "Skillet's in the left cabinet." She found it. She found the eggs, the bread, the small jar of lard. She worked without asking for guidance, moving through an unfamiliar kitchen, with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent years cooking in conditions a lot less cooperative than this one. Jonah sat at the table and didn't say anything. After a while, Webb came in, stopped dead at the sight of Abigail at the stove, looked at Jonah, and sat down. "Eggs," Abigail said without turning around. "Salt pork. Coffee's already made." "Yes, ma'am," Webb said with a note in his voice that sounded like approval. She set the food on the table and sat down herself at the end opposite Jonah. She ate without ceremony, so did they. Halfway through the meal, Webb said, "You sleep all right, Miss Turner." "Fine," she said. "Thank you for the lamp." "Room gets warm by mid-morning," he said. "Window faces east. You can prop it open, gets a cross breeze from the south side if you leave the hall door cracked." "I'll do that," she said. It was the most ordinary conversation she'd had in 14 months. The recognition of that hit her somewhere in the chest, quiet and strange. After breakfast, Jonah pushed back from the table and looked at her. "I'm going out to the north pasture. Fence line needs checking." He paused. "You don't need to do anything today. Rest if you want. Explore the place. Whatever you need." "I don't rest well," she said. "Neither do I," he said. They looked at each other across the table. Garden needs weeding. Webb offered in the tone of a man trying to be helpful. I'll start there, Abigail said. Dosh. The garden was behind the house, a good-sized plot that had been laid out with ambition, but was currently losing the argument with the summer heat and a lack of regular attention. Abigail walked the rows first, reading it what was salvageable, what was past help, what needed water most urgently. She worked through the morning without stopping. By noon, she had cleared 3 full rows, replanted 2 sections that had gotten tangled, and driven stakes for the bean plants that had flopped over. She was sweating hard, her dress damp and her hair escaping its pins, and she didn't care. She heard boots on the packed earth behind her. She didn't turn around. "Water," said Jonah's voice. She turned. He was standing at the edge of the garden with a tin cup in each hand. She took the one he held out. She drank. The water was cold. He'd drawn it from the well recently. He looked at the rows she'd cleared. He didn't say good work. He didn't make a production of it. He just looked, and something in the set of his face shifted slightly, the way a man's face shifts when he registers something he didn't expect. "Beans need the stakes in deeper," he said. "Ground's harder than it looks." "I noticed," she said. "I'll fix them this afternoon. I've got a better stake driver in the barn." "That would help." He nodded, didn't leave right away, stood there a moment, cup in hand, looking at the garden. "My wife planted this," he said. "It came out without preamble, the way things do when a person has been carrying them a long time, and something unexpected opens the door. She had plans for it, didn't get to finish them." Abigail didn't fill the silence with condolence. She'd learned that condolence was mostly for the person saying it. "What did she want to grow?" she asked. Something crossed his face. Not pain exactly, or not only pain. "Roses of all things," he said. "Said every place needs something that isn't useful." Abigail looked at the far end of the garden, where a struggling rosebush was losing its fight with the dry ground. "It's still alive," she said. Jonah looked at it. He looked at it for a long moment. "So it is," he said. He handed her the second cup of water. She hadn't noticed he'd held on to it, and walked back toward the barn. The first week passed in work. That was the language both of them spoke without having to learn it. Work. The ranch had more than enough of it, and Abigail moved through it with a thoroughness that surprised Webb, and she suspected surprised Jonah, though he didn't say so. She fixed the garden. She organized the larder, which had been kept in the way of a man living alone, functional but chaotic. She repaired 2 of the kitchen chairs that had been wobbling since apparently before anyone could remember. She kept the house and cooked, and did it all without being asked, because that was the arrangement she understood, and because the work gave her something to put her hands to. On the 4th day, she heard raised voices from outside. She was in the kitchen. The back door was open for the breeze. The voices were coming from the yard, Jonah's low and controlled, and another she didn't recognize. Higher. Harder. She went to the door. A man was standing in the yard she hadn't seen before. Medium height, dusty from the road, with the look of someone who'd ridden hard and hadn't cooled down. He was jabbing his finger at Jonah, who was standing with his arms loose at his sides and his face completely expressionless. "You can't just take her," the man was saying. "Silas had a legitimate contract. That paper was placed in a pot," Jonah said, "and lost in a fair hand. I own the contract. I've chosen not to enforce it." He paused. "That means Miss Turner is free." "You can't—" "I just did," Jonah said. "Simple as weather. Now you're on my property and I didn't invite you here. I'm going to ask you once to turn around." The man looked past Jonah and saw Abigail in the doorway. Something passed through his face that she recognized. She'd seen it before. Men who were used to a certain kind of power over a certain kind of situation, confronted with the fact that the situation had changed without their permission. "You," he said to her. "You think this is better? You think—" "Go," Jonah said. The word was quiet. It was also final in the way that a closing door is final. Not a threat, just an ending. The man looked at Jonah. He looked at Abigail. He looked back at Jonah. He turned and went. Jonah waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded down the road. Then he turned and looked at her in the doorway. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then, "Who was that?" "Works for Silas." He turned back toward the barn. "It won't be the last time." He said it matter-of-factly, the way a man reports weather. Not as a warning, not as reassurance, just as a fact she ought to know. She went back into the kitchen. She thought about that. It won't be the last time. No apology for it. No over-explanation. Just, this is what's ahead, and she'd given it to her straight. She found that she wasn't afraid. That surprised her. On the 7th day, she found the box. She was cleaning the top shelf of the main room, the kind of cleaning that happens when someone is thorough and reaches the places that have been left too long, and she brought down a wooden box about the size of a hat box, set it on the table, and opened it before she thought about whether she should. Inside, a woman's things, a pair of gloves, a small book of pressed flowers, a folded letter. She closed the box immediately and set it back on the shelf. When Jonah came in for supper that evening, she told him, "I found a box on the top shelf. I didn't look through it. I should have asked before touching it." He looked at her, then at the shelf. "Clara's," he said. "I'm sorry," she said. "Not condolence. Apology. Specific and meant." He nodded. After supper, when she was washing up, he came to the kitchen doorway. "She died 2 years ago this October," he said. "Lung fever. It came on fast." Abigail kept her hands in the wash water. Listened. "She would have liked the garden looked after," he said. It wasn't an invitation, but it was something. An opening in a wall that had been solid since she'd arrived, a gap that let a little air through. She wrung out the cloth and hung it. "I'll see to the roses," she said. "If that's all right?" "It's all right," he said. He went back to the front room. She stood in the kitchen alone for a moment. "I am not a possession." She'd said that to him on the wagon ride in the dark, braced for whatever came back at her. And what had come back was no argument from me. She hadn't trusted it then. She wasn't entirely sure she trusted it now. But she was beginning to understand that Jonah Cole was a man who meant what he said and said only what he meant, and that was rarer than she'd once believed it to be. She put away the last of the dishes. Outside, the Kansas night was pressing in hot and full of stars, crickets going at it like they had something urgent to settle. She went upstairs to the room with the quilt and the unlocked door. She was still here. That was something. That was she was beginning to suspect more than something. The morning Silas Stone's second man came to the ranch. Abigail was elbow-deep in bread dough. She heard the horse before she heard anything else. One horse moving fast, pulling up hard in the yard. Then boots on the porch boards, not Webb's measured step, not Jonah's quiet one, and a fist on the front door that wasn't knocking so much as announcing. She wiped her hands on her apron and stayed where she was. Jonah got to the door first. "Cole." The voice outside was flat, official-sounding in the practiced way of men who'd learned that tone from someone else. "I'm Deputy Harlan Briggs out of Sumner County. I need a word." "You're having one," Jonah said. A pause. Then, "Inside would be better." "It's plenty warm out there. Say what you came to say." Another pause, longer. Abigail could picture the man on the other side of that door deciding how much of his authority was real and how much was borrowed. "Silas Stone has filed a complaint," Briggs said. "Claims the card game last Tuesday was irregular. Claims you coerced him into putting the contract in the pot." "I coerced him," Jonah said. "That's his claim. I was sitting across a table from him with cards in my hand. He put the paper in himself. There were 3 other men at that table." A pause. "You talked to any of them?" Silence. "The contract is legal," Jonah continued. "The game was fair. I own it. I've chosen not to enforce it, which is my right as the holder. If Silas Stone has a problem with that, he can take it up with somebody who has actual jurisdiction over a private card game." Another pause. "Anything else?" The deputy's boots shifted on the porch. Cole, I'm just telling you what was filed. And I'm just telling you what happened, Jonah said. You have yourself a good ride back. The door didn't slam. It closed, which was worse. Abigail heard the deputy's horse leaving the yard. She heard Jonah's footsteps come back toward the kitchen. He appeared in the doorway, looked at her hands, still resting on the dough, and said nothing for a moment. He'll file again, Jonah said. I know, she said. Silas doesn't let things go. She looked up at him. Neither do I. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but close to the neighborhood. He got himself a cup of coffee and went back out. She punched the dough down and started over. The second week settled into a rhythm that Abigail didn't entirely trust yet, but was beginning to recognize. Mornings were Jonah's. He was out before full light working the cattle and the fence lines with Webb covering ground that she was only starting to understand the scale of. The ranch was larger than it looked from the yard. It sprawled north and west across land that had been worked hard and cared for in the way men care for things they intend to keep. She made breakfast for all three of them and left plates warm on the back of the stove for when they came in. She worked the garden through the morning heat, which by July in Kansas was considerable, and didn't apologize for itself. She kept the house. She started on the books because Jonah had mentioned them once, and she'd asked about them the next day, and he'd brought them out without ceremony. 2 ledgers, 1 current, and 1 going back 6 years, kept in the close handwriting of a man who was careful with numbers, if not always with words. She found 3 errors in the current ledger in the first hour. She corrected them, noted the corrections on a separate page with explanation, and left the ledger on the kitchen table. She didn't say anything about it at dinner. Neither did he. But the next morning the ledger was gone from the table, and a new one had appeared, and when she picked it up, she found he'd already transferred her corrections in and extended them forward. It wasn't acknowledgement. It wasn't exactly gratitude. But it was something a man adjusting to the fact that someone had done something better than he'd been doing it, and not making a production of being bothered by it. She found that she respected that. On the 9th day, Webb found her in the barn. She was there because one of the horses had been favoring his left foreleg since morning, and she'd gone to look without quite deciding to. She wasn't a horsewoman by training, but she'd been around animals enough to know that something being wrong and something being left alone were 2 different things. The horse, a roan gelding that Jonah called Amos, let her run her hands down the leg without fuss. She found the problem a stone packed up under the shoe, working at the frog of the hoof. She didn't have the tool to clear it, so she was looking for something that would do when Webb appeared. He watched her for a moment without speaking. Stone bruise, she said. Saw him favoring it this morning, Webb said. He moved in crouched, looked at what she was pointing to. You've worked with horses before. Some, she said. Not professionally. Webb straightened up. He had the pick tool on his belt. She hadn't noticed it until now, and he cleared the stone with 3 practiced movements. Amos shifted, side settled. Webb stood up and looked at her. You want to tell me how you ended up in Caldwell? He said. It wasn't demanded. It was asked, and there was a difference. Abigail considered. My family had debts, she said. My father borrowed from Silas Stone when we were coming through the territory 2 years ago. He died before he could repay it. Silas had a document. I still don't know if it was legal or if he wrote it himself, but it had my father's mark on it, and I had no way to fight it alone. She paused. So I worked it. Webb was quiet for a moment. Jonah know all that? He asked. I told him some of it. He won't ask for more than you give him, Webb said. That's his way. Doesn't push. He put the pick back on his belt. Clara used to say it was his best quality and his worst one depending on the day. It was the first time Webb had mentioned Clara directly to her. She waited to see if there was more. She was something, Webb said. Not sad exactly. Fond and sad at the same time, the way people talk about things that were real and are gone. This ranch was different when she was here. Not better or worse different. Louder maybe. More color to it. He looked at Amos. He's been very quiet since. Abigail didn't say anything. I'm not telling you that for any particular reason, Webb said as if he'd read her silence. Just telling you. All right, she said. He touched his hat brim and went back to whatever he'd been doing. She stood with Amos a while longer. The horse turned his head and looked at her with one dark eye, patient and unconcerned with the whole business. Yeah, she said to him. I know. 12 days after she arrived, Jonah came to supper with a cut on his forearm that he wasn't mentioning. She noticed it the way she noticed most things without making a ceremony of the noticing. A 2-inch gash not deep enough to be dangerous, but deep enough to need cleaning, already starting to crust at the edges in a way that said it had been left alone since it happened, probably hours ago. She put his plate in front of him, went to the washstand, got a clean cloth and the iodine from the shelf, and set both on the table beside his plate without comment. He looked at them. He looked at her. He looked back at the cloth. Fence wire, he said. I figured, she said. She sat down across from him and started eating. He cleaned the cut himself, which she'd expected. She hadn't offered to do it. She understood without being told that Jonah Cole was a man who would accept help when it was put in front of him and not ask for it, and not particularly want it made into a moment. He poured iodine on the cloth and pressed it to his arm and didn't make a sound, which she also expected. Webb says there's a section of north fence that needs replacing, she said. Not just restringing. He's right, Jonah said. Was going to get to it. I can help with that. He looked up from his arm. It's heavy work, he said. Not dismissive, factual. I know what heavy work is, she said, equally factual. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went back to his plate. All right, he said. Day after tomorrow. That was all. No qualification. No explanation of what she'd need to do or how it would work. Just all right, day after tomorrow. As if her word that she could do a thing was sufficient reason to let her try it. She didn't say thank you. She didn't think he wanted that. She just ate her supper. The letter came on a Thursday. Webb brought it in from town, set it on the table, and his face was doing something careful when he did it. Abigail noticed that. Webb's face didn't do careful things without reason. She was in the kitchen. Jonah wasn't in yet. It's addressed to him, Webb said. But it's got a Sumner County court seal on it. She looked at the envelope on the table. Thank you, Webb, she said. He left. She did not touch the letter. She went back to the beans she was sorting and sorted them until she heard Jonah's boots on the porch. She heard him come through the door, cross the main room, pause at the table. The sound of paper being picked up. Silence. She kept sorting. After a minute, he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was holding the open letter. Silas filed a formal claim, he said. Through the county court. He's arguing the card game was fraudulent and the contract should revert to him. She set down the beans. Can he do that? He can file anything he wants, Jonah said. Filing and winning are different things. He folded the letter. I need to go into town tomorrow. Talk to a lawyer. Do you have one? Martin Feld. Handled the ranch deed when I bought the place. A pause. He's honest, which in Caldwell makes him unusual. She looked at him. Do you want me to come? The question surprised him. She could see that. He hadn't expected it. You don't need to, he said. I know I don't need to, she said. Do you want me to? He was quiet a moment. It might help, he said. Feld will want to hear your account of the arrangement. Then I'll come, she said. She went back to the beans. We should leave early, before the heat. He went back to the main room. She heard him sit down in the chair by the window, the one he sat in most evenings facing west. She could picture him there reading the letter again, working through it the way he worked through most things methodically, without visible alarm, turning every piece of it over in his hands until he understood what he was dealing with. She finished the beans. She went upstairs. She stood at the window of her room and looked out at the dark yard, and thought about Silas Stone, sitting in some office in Caldwell, writing his complaint in the careful language of a man who believed he had the right to put people in pots and take them back when the game didn't go his way. Her hands were not shaking. That was new. A year ago, 6 months ago, the thought of Silas pursuing her through official channels would have put ice in her stomach and kept it there. She'd spent 14 months understanding exactly how much power he had and how little she did. But something had shifted in 12 days. She wasn't sure what to call it yet. It wasn't safety. She wasn't naive enough to believe she was safe. Silas Stone was not a man who accepted no for an answer, and the paper in his pocket was real enough to do damage in the right courtroom. But she was not alone anymore. That was the shift. That was the thing she hadn't had in a long time, and was only now recognizing the weight of. She was not alone. They rode into Caldwell the next morning before 7. Martin Feld's office was on the main street between the assay office and a dry goods store that had seen better decades. He was a small man with a large desk and the organized precision of someone who had spent years making sure nothing could be held against him. He shook Jonah's hand and looked at Abigail with the careful neutrality of a man reserving judgment. "Miss Turner," he said, "sit down, please." She sat. He asked her to account for herself, which she did clearly, in order without embellishment or apology. The debt. Her father's death. The document. The 14 months. The card game. Feld listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "The contract itself," he said. "Do you have it?" She reached into her dress pocket and put it on his desk. He unfolded it. He read it. He read it again. He turned it over and looked at the back. He set it down. "This is not," he said carefully, "a legal instrument under Kansas territorial law. Indentured contracts of this nature were outlawed in 1867. What this document represents is essentially a private agreement between a dead man and Silas Stone with no legal standing to bind you." He paused. "The question is, why no one told you that 14 months ago?" Abigail looked at him steadily. "Because I had no one to ask," she said. Feld had the grace to look uncomfortable. "The claim Silas has filed," Jonah said. "What does it amount to?" "Noise," Feld said. "At the moment. He's arguing the card game was fraudulent, which he'll have difficulty proving without the testimony of the other players, who, based on what you've told me, saw nothing fraudulent." He tapped the contract. "And his claim of ownership is void regardless. The contract isn't enforceable." A pause. "However." "There's always a however," Jonah said. "Silas Stone has friends on the county bench," Feld said. "That doesn't change the law, but it changes how fast the law moves and how much it costs you to make it move in the right direction." He looked at Jonah. "Are you prepared to fight this properly if it goes to a hearing?" "Yes," Jonah said. "It may take time." "It can take what it takes," Jonah said. "Miss Turner is not going back to him. That's the one thing that isn't negotiable." Feld looked at Abigail. She met his gaze without flinching. "Very well," he said. He picked up his pen. "Let me start drawing up a response." They were back on the road by 10. The heat had arrived in full by then, pressing down on the flat Kansas land with the indifferent weight of a July sun that had no particular interest in anyone's comfort. Neither of them spoke for the first mile. Then Abigail said, "He said the contract was never legal." "That's what he said," Jonah confirmed. "I worked 14 months on a document that had no legal standing." "Appears so." She looked straight ahead at the road, at the horse's ears, at the long flat horizon. "If I'd known that," she said. Her voice was even. "If I'd had someone to ask." "I know," Jonah said. "I want to be angry about it," she said. "I'm trying to figure out who to be angry at." "Silas Stone's a reasonable place to start," Jonah said. She almost laughed. Not quite, but the corner of her mouth moved. "He knew it wasn't legal," she said. "He knew it, and he used it anyway. That's who he is," Jonah said. "Men like Silas don't need the law to be on their side. They just need people not to know the law well enough to fight back. She thought about that for a long stretch of road. Well, she said finally, I know it now. Jonah glanced at her sidelong. Something in his face that she was learning to read, not quite approval, not quite admiration, but something in that territory that he kept very quiet and very close. Yes, you do, he said. They rode the rest of the way in the good kind of silence. 3 days later, Silas came himself. She heard him from inside the house. His voice was one she'd spent 14 months learning to track the same way she tracked weather, reading its temperature and direction, calibrating her own responses to it. She knew his angry voice, and his pleasant voice, and his dangerous voice, which was the quiet one. Today he was using the pleasant one. She came to the front room and looked out the window. Silas was in the yard on his horse, and he was smiling, and Jonah was standing on the porch with his arms folded and his face doing nothing in particular. I'm not here to make trouble, Silas was saying. I'm here to make a reasonable offer. I'm listening, Jonah said. His tone made it clear he was doing so only technically. The girl's not worth the legal fight, Silas said pleasantly. I think we both know that. I'll withdraw the complaint and you can keep whatever arrangement you've got here, and we call the whole thing settled. He spread his hands. Easy and done. And what do you want in return? Jonah said. The section of creek land. Silas's smile didn't waver. The strip along your north border that runs down to Miller's Creek. 3 acres, give or take. I've been after it for 2 years. You sell it to me at a fair price and we're square. Abigail knew about that land. She'd heard Webb and Jonah talk about it, a water access point that served a portion of the north pasture. Without it, the cattle couldn't reach the creek in dry season without a significant detour. Jonah knew exactly what Silas was doing. She could see it in the stillness of him. No, Jonah said. Silas's smile adjusted, just slightly. Cole, he said, patience beginning to show its edges. Be reasonable. It's just land. It's my land, Jonah said. And the answer's no. The court complaint is going to cost you more than that land is worth? Maybe, Jonah said. That's between me and the court. You're not invited into that conversation. Silas looked at him for a long moment. The pleasant voice was gone now. What replaced it was the quiet one, and Abigail felt it from inside the house, like a pressure change. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Silas said. You put a woman in a poker pot, Jonah said. His voice was still even, still calm, but there was something underneath it now, something with weight and edge that he'd been keeping back. You kept her in a storage room for 14 months on a document you knew wasn't worth the paper it was written on. You sent 2 men to my property and filed a fraudulent court complaint. He paused. I'm making this exactly as hard as it needs to be. You want to be done with it, withdraw your claim and don't come back to my property. That's the only offer I'm making. Silas sat on his horse for a long moment. You'll regret this, he said. Still quiet, still the dangerous voice. I've regretted things before, Jonah said. Get off my land, Silas. Silas turned his horse and left. Jonah stood on the porch until the sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he turned and looked at the window where Abigail was standing. She moved away from it. She went back to the kitchen, sat down at the table, put her hands flat on the wood and looked at them. She heard the front door open. Jonah's footsteps through the main room. He appeared in the kitchen doorway. You heard that, he said. Yes. He's not going to stop, Jonah said. I want you to know that. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. She looked up at him. What he said about the creek land, she said. He wants you to pay for keeping me here. I know what he wants, Jonah said. I'm costing you. Abigail. He said her name for the first time since the night they'd arrived, and something about hearing it in his voice, direct and undecorated, stopped her mid-thought. What Silas Stone is costing me is nothing I'm not willing to pay. That's not your problem to carry. She looked at him. Why, she said. The same question she'd asked in the saloon. She asked it differently now, not with suspicion, but with something that needed to understand. He was quiet for a moment. "Because it's right," he said finally. "And because I've spent 2 years not doing much that was right, and it turns out that matters." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. He got the coffee pot and poured himself a cup. He poured one for her too, set it in front of her without being asked, and sat down across the table. They sat in the kitchen in the July heat with the coffee going cold between them, and it was the most comfortable Abigail had felt in a room with another person in longer than she could clearly remember. The hearing date came back from Feld 2 weeks later, August the 14th, 3 weeks away. There was work to do before then, statements to prepare, witnesses to identify, documents to organize. Feld had sent a list. Jonah read it at the supper table, passed it to Abigail and said, "Tell me what's missing." She read it. She added 3 things. He sent them back to Feld the next morning. In the evenings, when the work was done and the heat had eased by a degree or two, they sometimes sat on the front porch. Not every evening. Not by arrangement. But it happened often enough to become a thing that happened, which was its own kind of arrangement. Jonah didn't talk much in those hours. That was fine. Neither did she. But there were moments, small ones, unremarkable from the outside, the kind that don't announce themselves, that Abigail found herself storing without meaning to. The evening he came in with a wildflower he'd found along the fence line, something scraggly and yellow that had no business thriving in that heat, and set it in a jar on the kitchen windowsill without explanation. The morning he noticed she'd been using a paring knife that was overdue for sharpening, and left it on the counter re-edged without mentioning it. The day she came in from the garden, exhausted, and found cold water waiting on the kitchen table, drawn and set out, and no one in the room who needed thanking for it. None of these were declarations. None of them were the kind of gestures that announce themselves. They were the quiet accumulation of one person paying attention to another person, which was the rarest thing she knew of, and she'd known its absence long enough to recognize what it felt like to have it back. She did not call it anything yet. She wasn't ready to call it anything. She'd been burned by naming things too early, had learned that hope was a thing to be kept close and quiet, until you were sure the ground under it was solid. But the ground was starting to feel more solid, and the rose bush at the end of the garden, the one Clara had planted, the one she'd said every place needs something that isn't useful, had put out 2 new buds in the July heat, stubborn and small and red as anything. She'd told Jonah at supper that evening. He'd looked at her across the table. "She'd have liked knowing you were looking after it," he said. She went very still for a moment. "I'll keep at it," she said. He nodded. Outside, the Kansas night was settling in, hot and vast, and full of its own quiet urgency. And inside the ranch house on the North Road out of Caldwell, 2 people were figuring out, in the careful way of people who have both been hurt, what it meant to let someone else matter. That was the work of those weeks. Harder than the fence line. Harder than the garden. Harder than any of it. And neither of them was ready to stop. The week before the hearing, Abigail stopped sleeping through the night. Not from fear, or not only from fear. It was the kind of wakefulness that comes when too many things are moving at once and a person's mind refuses to stop tracking them, even when the body is flat out and exhausted. She'd lie in the room with the quilt and the unlocked door and run through it all. Feld's list, the witnesses, the document Silas had filed, the things she'd need to say in front of a county judge, who might or might not have been bought. She knew courtrooms. Not from the inside, she'd never had the standing or the resources to get inside one on her own behalf, but from the outside, from watching what happened to people who went in without money or connections and came out with less than they'd had before. She knew that the law was a tool, and like any tool, it worked best for the person who knew how to hold it. Silas Stone knew how to hold it. The question was whether Martin Feld knew how to hold it better. On Wednesday morning, 5 days before the hearing, she was up before 4. She came downstairs, stoked the stove, and started the coffee. She sat at the kitchen table with Feld's prepared statement in front of her, and read it again for the 7th time. She heard footsteps on the stairs. Jonah appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed, fully dressed, hat in hand, which meant he hadn't come down because of the noise. He'd been awake too. He looked at the papers on the table. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything about it. He got a cup, poured coffee, sat across from her. He looked at the statement. "What's wrong with it?" he said. Not a question. He'd seen her face. "The language Feld uses in the third section," she said. She pointed to it. "He says I was in Silas's employ. I wasn't in his employ. I was in his captivity. Those are different things, and a good lawyer on Silas's side will use that word to make it sound like I entered the arrangement voluntarily." Jonah read the section. He read it again. "You're right," he said. "It needs to say contracted labor under duress," she said, "or coerced servitude, something that reflects what it actually was." "I'll ride to Feld's this morning," Jonah said. "I'll come." He looked at her. "Abigail, you don't have to be at every... It's my life in that courtroom," she said, evenly without heat. "I'll come." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. They rode to Caldwell in the dark before sunrise with the stars still out, and the road empty, and the only sound was the horses' hooves and the dry chorus of insects in the grass that never quite quit even in the dead of night in July in Kansas. Feld was not pleased to see them at 6 in the morning, but he was professional enough not to say so. He read the section Abigail pointed to, and his face did the slow rearrangement of a man who has just realized someone else caught something he missed. "You're correct," he said. He didn't make it smaller than it was. "I'd also like to add a witness," she said. Feld looked up. "Who?" "Hank Mueller," she said. "Barkeep's son. He was at the table the night of the card game. He saw Silas put the contract in the pot voluntarily." She paused. "And I think he knows more about Silas's other arrangements than he's said publicly. He was uncomfortable that night. He left right after Jonah called." Feld looked at Jonah. "I can find him," Jonah said. "Finding him and getting him to testify are two different things," Feld said carefully. "I'll talk to him," Abigail said. "He's not a bad man. He was just in a room full of them and didn't know what to do." Feld considered this. If he's willing, yes. His testimony would strengthen the case significantly. He looked at her with an expression that had shifted somewhere during this conversation from professionally neutral to something closer to genuine regard. "Miss Turner, have you had legal training?" "No," she said. "I've had a difficult life. It turns out those develop similar skills." Feld almost smiled. He picked up his pen. "Let me revise the statement," he said. She found Hank Mueller at his father's saloon, which was not the Dust Devil that was Silas's place, but a smaller, quieter establishment on the south end of Caldwell's main street that catered to men who wanted a drink without a card game attached to it. Hank was 23, broad in the shoulder, and currently moving chairs off tables with the mechanical efficiency of someone performing a task he'd done 10,000 times. He saw her come through the door and stopped with a chair in his hands and went very still. "Miss Turner," he said. "Hank," she said. She kept her voice easy. She'd thought about this on the ride over the tone to use the approach. Push too hard and he'd close. Move too soft and he'd think she didn't mean it. "Can I talk to you a minute?" He set the chair down. "Ma'am, I don't want any part of whatever's going on between Silas and—" "I know you don't," she said. "That's why I want to talk to you." She pulled out a chair and sat down at the table nearest the door. "Sit down, Hank." He sat. "I'm not asking you to take on Silas Stone," she said. "I'm asking you to tell the truth about what you saw at that table. That's all it is." He looked at the tabletop. "You know what Silas does to people who cross him." "I know what he does to people who let him," she said. "Those aren't the same thing either." She leaned forward slightly. "Hank, you were uncomfortable that night. I saw it. Every person at that table except Silas Stone knew something wrong was happening, and you were the only one who looked like it bothered you." He was quiet. "Silas put a woman in a poker pot," she said. "And you know he's done things like that before. You've seen it." Hank's jaw tightened. "You tell me no, and I'll go," she said. "I'm not here to force anything, but I need you to understand that what's in front of that judge isn't just about me. It's about whether Silas Stone gets to keep doing this to people who don't have anyone to stand up for them." Silence. "I've got a wife," Hank said. "We've got a baby coming in October." "I know," she said. "That's not nothing. I'm not asking you to do something that's nothing." He looked at her. He was struggling with something. She could see the weight of it on him. The competing pressures of his own conscience and his own fear, which was the oldest conflict in the world and one of the hardest. "What would I need to say?" he asked. She told him. She came back to the ranch at noon. Jonah was on the porch. He'd been watching the road. She could tell by the way he straightened when she turned in through the gate. He waited until she'd pulled up and climbed down before he asked. "Well?" he said. "He'll testify," she said. Jonah looked at her. "How?" he said. "I talked to him," she said. She handed the reins off to Webb, who had appeared from the direction of the barn with the timing he always seemed to have. He's not a coward. He just needed someone to give him a reason bigger than his fear. Jonah was quiet a moment. "He knows Silas will come after him. He knows," she said. "He decided it mattered more to do the right thing." She paused. "He's going to be a father in October. Those men usually have more courage than they think they do when it's about something that counts." Jonah looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she became aware of it as a look, not just a glance. "You did that in a morning," he said. "I had practice being persuasive," she said. 14 months of it. I just decided to use it for something better than surviving." She walked past him into the house. Behind her, she heard him make a sound quiet low. Not quite a laugh, but something that lived near one. It was the first time she'd heard anything like that from him, and it settled into her like warmth from a stove, slow and real, and more welcome than she was ready to say. 2 days before the hearing, the twist came from a direction nobody had anticipated. Webb came in at supper, looking the way Webb looked when he had something to say, and wasn't sure how to say it. A particular arrangement of his face that Abigail had come to read over the past weeks, the way you learn the weather signs of a particular piece of land. He sat down. He waited until the food was on the table. Then he said, "Ran into Doc Halley in town today." Jonah looked up. "How is he?" "He's fine." Webb paused. "He said something, though. Said Silas has been asking around about you, Jonah, not about the case, about Clara." The air in the kitchen changed. Abigail kept her hands on the table and her face even. "What about Clara?" Jonah said. His voice was still level, but there was something different underneath it. "About how she died," Webb said. "Silas is apparently telling people the lung fever story isn't the whole story. He's suggesting, and Doc Halley was very clear this is just Silas running his mouth. He's suggesting that there were questions about it at the time that nobody followed up on." Silence. "He's going to use it," Abigail said, not a question. "Appears so," Webb said. "Try to muddy the water before the hearing. Make Jonah look like a man with something to hide." Jonah had not moved. He was looking at the plate in front of him, not seeing it. Abigail watched him. She watched the way stillness settled over him, that was different from his usual stillness. Tighter, deeper, the stillness of a man holding something down with both hands. "It was lung fever," he said. "Quiet. Factual. She got sick in November. She was gone by January. Doc Halley was there. There were no questions." "I know that," Webb said. "Doc Halley knows that. But Silas is going to stand up in that courtroom and imply otherwise, and count on the doubt doing his work for him." Abigail said, "Can Feld get Doc Halley to testify?" Webb looked at her. Jonah looked at her. "Clara's death certificate," she said. "Cause of death, physician of record, all of it. If Silas wants to raise questions, we answer them before he finishes asking them. Feld calls Doc Halley, puts the record in front of the judge, and Silas's insinuation lands on nothing." Jonah looked at her for a moment that went longer than the usual kind. "That's the right move," he said. "Then let's make it," she said. She said it like it was simple. It wasn't simple. She knew exactly what it cost Jonah Cole to have his wife's death discussed in a county courtroom, to have it turned into a weapon by a man like Silas Stone. She knew what it cost because she'd seen the box on that shelf and heard the way he said Clara's name and understood that grief doesn't get smaller, only quieter. But she also knew that letting Silas have an unchallenged weapon was worse. After supper, she was washing up when Jonah came to stand in the kitchen doorway. "I haven't talked about her death much," he said, "to anyone." She kept her hands in the water. "I know. It was the worst winter of my life," he said, "and I've had some difficult winters." "I believe that," she said. He was quiet a moment. Then, "I don't want you to think what Silas is implying. I don't want there to be any question about it." She turned from the washstand and looked at him directly. "Jonah," she said. His name the way he'd said hers, direct and plain, and meaning what it said. "I have spent weeks in this house with you. I have watched how you treat your land and your animals and your people. I know what kind of man you are." She paused. "Silas can imply whatever he wants. It doesn't land on me." He held her gaze. Something passed across his face that was too complicated to name and too real to look away from. "Thank you," he said, quiet and completely genuine. "Go get some sleep," she said. "We've got 2 days." He went. She stayed at the washstand a moment longer, with the water going cold around her hands, her heart doing something she was doing her best not to examine too closely. 2 days. The day before the hearing, Silas made his last move. It came in the form of a woman named Ruth Carver, who appeared at the ranch gate in the early afternoon and asked to speak to Abigail Turner. Webb came to find her in the garden. "Woman at the gate," he said. "Says she knows you from Caldwell. Says it's important." Abigail didn't recognize the name, but she went. Ruth Carver was perhaps 40, with the look of someone who had carried too much for too long and made peace with the weight of it. She was neatly dressed, composed, and clearly nervous about being here. Her hands were doing things with her reticule that her face wasn't admitting to. "Miss Turner," she said when Abigail reached the gate. "I'm sorry to come without warning. I work at the millinery on 5th Street. She paused. "I worked for Silas Stone 3 years ago. Similar arrangement to yours." Abigail went still. "He settled with me privately," Ruth continued, "in exchange for me not raising any legal complaint. Part of the settlement was an agreement not to speak about the arrangement publicly." She paused. "I'm breaking that agreement by coming here." "Then why are you here?" Abigail said. "Because I heard about your hearing tomorrow," Ruth said. "And because I've spent 3 years watching Silas Stone do this to people and telling myself it wasn't my problem anymore." She reached into her reticule and took out an envelope. "This is a copy of my original contract with him. Same language as yours, same structure. My lawyer at the time told me it was unenforceable under territorial law." She paused. "If Feld can use it to establish a pattern that Silas has done this before knowingly with documents he knew weren't legal, it changes what the judge is looking at." Abigail took the envelope. She looked at this woman, who had driven out to a ranch she'd never been to hand over a document that broke a legal agreement because her conscience had finally gotten louder than her fear. "You know he'll come after you for this," Abigail said. "I know," Ruth said. "I have a good lawyer now." A small dry smile. "Better than the one I had 3 years ago." "What made you decide?" Abigail said. Ruth looked at her. "Because you didn't run," she said simply. "When I heard you'd stayed and you were going to fight it in court, I thought if she can do that after 14 months of it, the least I can do is hand over a piece of paper." Abigail held the envelope. "Thank you," she said. "Come inside. I need to send a rider to Feld immediately, and you should probably talk to him tonight." Ruth Carver straightened. Something in her eased the particular ease of a person who has made a hard decision and survived the making of it. "All right," she said. "Let's do this properly then." Feld came to the ranch that evening. He sat at the kitchen table and read Ruth Carver's contract, and his face went through several changes, each one more focused than the last. "This establishes intent," he said. "Silas didn't stumble into an unenforceable contract by accident. He's been using the same structure repeatedly on purpose, knowing it wasn't legal." He set the document down. "This is no longer just a dispute over a card game. This is a pattern of fraud. Can you use it tomorrow?" Jonah said. "I can use it tomorrow," Feld said. He looked at Abigail. "How did you get her to come forward?" "I didn't," Abigail said. "She came on her own." Feld looked at her with that expression he'd developed over the past 2 weeks, the one that said he was recalibrating his estimate of what he was dealing with. "Miss Turner," he said, "I've been practicing law in this territory for 11 years. I don't say this lightly." He picked up his pen. "You would have made an extraordinary attorney." She looked at him steadily. "Noted," she said. "Now tell me what time we need to be at the courthouse." That night the house was quiet in the particular way of the night before, something that matters. Abigail came downstairs at 10. She'd tried to sleep and her mind wouldn't cooperate, and found Jonah on the front porch in the dark. She pushed open the door and came out without asking if he wanted company, because asking seemed like the wrong move, and she'd learned to read him well enough to know when the wrong move was. She sat in the other chair. The Kansas night was doing what it always did in July, pressing down hot and enormous and full of stars that were indifferent to everything below them. Somewhere out in the dark, something moved in the grass and then went still. "I keep thinking about what Silas said," Jonah said after a while, "about Clara." "Don't," she said. "Hard not to." "I know," she said, "but he doesn't get to have that. What happened to Clara was real, and it was yours, and Silas Stone doesn't get to put his hands on it just because he needs a weapon." Jonah was quiet. "She would have liked you," he said. He said it carefully, like something he'd been turning over and had finally decided to put down. "She had no patience for people who made themselves small to make other people comfortable. She would have—" He stopped. "She would have respected you." Abigail's chest did something complicated. She thought about the quilt on her bed, the rose bush, the box on the shelf that she'd touched once and never touched again. "Tell me something about her," she said. "Something good. Something that isn't about losing her." He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she thought she'd asked wrong. Then he said, "She burned every single thing she cooked for the first year we were married. Not bad burned. Black, actual smoke. She thought it was the stove. I didn't tell her for 6 months that it was the way she set the temperature." Abigail looked at him. "Why didn't you tell her?" "Because she was so sure it was the stove," he said, "and she kept trying different things to fix it. She was so determined." He paused. "When she finally figured it out, she threw a dishcloth at me." Abigail laughed. It came out before she could decide about it, a real laugh, the kind that doesn't ask permission. She hadn't heard herself laugh like that in a long time, and the sound of it surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him. He looked at her, and for the first time in the dark on the porch, the night before the hearing that would decide the shape of both their lives, Jonah Cole smiled. A real one. The kind that reached his eyes and changed his whole face and made him look younger by a decade. She stopped laughing. Not because the moment was over, but because something else had moved into it, something that took up more space and had more weight, and neither of them was quite ready to name. She looked at the yard. He looked at the yard. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too," she said. She went inside. She lay in the room with the quilt and looked at the ceiling and put her hand flat on her sternum, where her heart was doing something she was done pretending wasn't happening. She was not a woman who fell quickly. She'd learned the hard way that quick falling was a luxury for people whose lives had given them safe places to land. But she also knew the difference between a thing beginning and a thing that had already begun, and she was honest enough with herself in the dark the night before. Everything to admit which one this was. August 14th arrived like any other Kansas morning, which is to say it arrived hot and certain, and without the slightest acknowledgement that it was any more significant than the one before it. Abigail was dressed before 6, dark blue dress, the better one properly pressed, hair pinned well. She came downstairs and Jonah was already in the kitchen in his good jacket. She'd never seen him in the good jacket, which told her something about what the day meant to him. Webb came in from outside, hat in hand. "Horse is ready," he said. He looked at both of them. "You want me to come?" "Stay with the ranch," Jonah said. Webb looked like he wanted to argue. He didn't. He touched his hat brim to Abigail. "Give 'em hell, Miss Turner." She touched his arm as she passed, just briefly. They rode to Caldwell in the rising heat of an August morning, and the road that had been empty the first time she'd ridden it 5 weeks ago. Terrified, uncertain, unwilling to hope for anything. Felt different under her now. Solid. Known. She was different on it. She sat straight on the wagon bench and kept her eyes forward, and thought about what she was going to walk into, and she was not afraid. Nervous, yes. Afraid, no. Fear was what Silas Stone was counting on. He'd built his whole operation on it. On the fact that people who were alone and broke and without standing would be too frightened to fight back. She had been those things. She was none of them anymore. Jonah glanced at her sidelong as they turned onto Caldwell's main street. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the courthouse at the end of the block. Silas's horse was already tied out front. 3 or 4 men she didn't recognize standing near the door, his people probably. She looked at them. "I've been ready for 14 months, she said. "I just finally have what I needed to do something about it." Jonah set his jaw in the way that meant he was decided. He clicked to the horse. They pulled up in front of the courthouse and stopped. And for a moment, just one, the whole world went quiet in the way it does before something breaks or something holds. Then Abigail Turner stepped down from the wagon, set her feet on the ground, and walked toward the door. The courthouse in Caldwell was not a grand building. It was 2 rooms wide and smelled of old paper and pine resin, and the particular kind of human anxiety that soaks into walls over years of difficult decisions. The gallery benches were already half filled when Abigail and Jonah walked through the door, and the noise in the room dropped by a noticeable degree the moment they appeared. She felt the eyes. She'd been feeling eyes on her for 14 months in the saloon in the street, in every room she'd walked into in Caldwell. She'd learned to move through them the way you move through weather. You didn't fight it. You just kept walking. Silas Stone was already at his table on the left side of the room. He had a lawyer she didn't recognize, a tall man with a narrow face, and the kind of suit that advertised itself, and 2 other men seated behind him, who had the look of paid witnesses. Silas himself was composed in the careful way of a man who has prepared his face for a performance. He glanced at her when she came in, and then away as if she were furniture he'd already accounted for. Martenfeld was at the right table, his papers arranged with the precision of a man who had been up since before 4. He looked up when they approached, took in Abigail's face, and nodded once. "You look ready," he said. "I am," she said. Hank Mueller was in the gallery 3rd row, sitting very straight and looking like a man who'd made a decision he intended to honor regardless of how it felt. She caught his eye as she passed and gave him a small nod. He nodded back. His hands on his knees were not quite steady, but they were there. Ruth Carver was in the back row, which was where Ruth Carver had decided to be close enough to be called far enough to be calm. Doc Halley was beside her with his medical bag on the floor at his feet, out of habit, the way doctors bring the bag everywhere, because you never know. Abigail sat beside Feld. Jonah sat behind her in the gallery close enough that she could feel the solid fact of him without turning around. The judge arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. Judge Thomas Archer was 60 gray and had the look of a man who had spent decades sorting through what was real and what was performed and had developed considerable patience for neither. He settled into his chair, looked out at the room with eyes that registered everything without appearing to, and called the proceeding to order. Silas's lawyer went first. His name was a Caldwell man named Prescott, and he was good. Abigail recognized that immediately. He was the kind of good that comes from knowing which emotions to play and when to play them. He talked about the sanctity of legal agreements. He talked about Mr. Stone's investment of time and resources. He talked about the card game in terms that made it sound like Jonah had done something predatory. He did not once look at Abigail as a person. She noticed that. She filed it. When Prescott finished, Feld stood up. He was quiet in the way that commanded rooms not from volume, but from precision. He laid out the timeline without drama. The debt. The death of Abigail's father. The document Silas had produced. The 14 months. The card game. Then he put the document on the judge's bench. "Your Honor," he said, "what Mr. Stone has characterized as a legal contract is not a legal instrument under Kansas territorial law. Indentured contracts of this nature were outlawed by statute in 1867, 7 years before this document was allegedly written." He paused. "Mr. Stone is an experienced businessman who has operated in this territory for over a decade. He knew the law. He wrote this document anyway and used it to confine a woman against her will for 14 months. Prescott was on his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is characterizing. Sustained on the editorializing," Judge Archer said. "Mr. Feld, stick to what you can demonstrate." "Of course, Your Honor," Feld said. He didn't look rattled. "I intend to demonstrate exactly that." Hank Mueller took the stand first. He sat down, adjusted himself, looked at the room with the careful expression of a man reminding himself why he was doing what he was doing. Feld's questions were simple and direct. "Were you present at the Dust Devil Saloon on the evening of July 8th? "Yes, sir." "Were you at the poker table when the document in question was placed in the pot?" "Yes, sir." "Did you witness any coercion of Mr. Stone by the defendant, Jonah Cole?" Hank's jaw set. "No, sir. Silas put that paper in himself. Nobody asked him to. Nobody pushed him to. He did it on his own because he was out of cash and he didn't want to leave the table." He paused. There was nothing irregular about that game. Prescott cross-examined hard. He pushed on Hank's relationship with Jonah, on whether he'd been paid for his testimony, on whether he had personal reasons to want to damage Silas Stone's business. Hank answered every question with the blunt honesty of someone who has decided that this is the hill and he is staying on it. "I don't have anything against Silas Stone except what I saw in that room," he said. "And what I saw was a man put a woman in a poker pot the same way he'd put in a promissory note. That's what I'm telling you, because that's what happened." Prescott tried one more angle. "And you felt compelled to come forward with this testimony because it's the truth," Hank said. "Simple as that. And the truth's the truth whether it's convenient or not." Archer looked at Hank for a moment. "Thank you, Mr. Mueller," he said. "You may step down." Ruth Carver took the stand like someone who had been afraid of this moment for 3 years and was done being afraid of it. When Feld put her contract on the bench beside Abigail's, and when he walked Judge Archer through the language side by side, same structure, same terms, same legal framework that Silas had used 3 years earlier, on a different woman with a different dead father and a different inability to fight back. Something changed in the room. It was the change that happens when a pattern becomes visible. Not an accident. Not a misunderstanding. A method. Prescott objected 3 times during Ruth's testimony. Archer overruled him twice and sustained him once on a technicality that didn't change the substance of what Ruth had said. When Prescott stood to cross-examine, he looked at Ruth Carver and said, "Mrs. Carver, you signed a private settlement that specifically prohibited you from discussing the arrangement you had with Mr. Stone. Is that correct?" "Yes," she said. "And you chose to break that agreement?" "Yes," she said. "Why?" Ruth Carver looked at him. Then she looked past him at Silas Stone, who was watching her with the still calculating expression she recognized from 3 years ago and had never entirely stopped seeing in her sleep. "Because a settlement I was pressured into signing to keep me quiet doesn't have more value than the truth," she said. "And because I was tired of being quiet." The room was very still. Prescott sat down. Silas's lawyer called Silas to the stand. That was the move Abigail had expected and the one she'd talked to Feld about the night before. Silas was good in front of people. He had the particular gift of making himself sound reasonable while doing unreasonable things, and he'd be counting on it now. He settled into the witness chair with the air of a man who was comfortable in rooms where things were decided. He answered Prescott's questions in the steady voice of an aggrieved businessman. He had made a loan in good faith, accepted a contract in lieu of repayment, operated entirely within the understanding of the arrangement, and had been blindsided by a card game he'd been manipulated into. He was plausible. Abigail could feel the room listening, could feel some of it wanting to believe him. She looked at Feld. Feld stood up. "Mr. Stone," he said, "you've testified that the contract with Miss Turner's family was a standard arrangement for the territory. Is that correct?" "It is," Silas said. "Are you familiar with the Territorial Labor Act of 1867? A pause, barely perceptible, but Abigail caught it. "Generally," Silas said. "Are you familiar with the specific provision that prohibits indentured service contracts of the type you've described as standard?" Prescott was up. "Objection. Calls for—" "He's testified he's familiar with territorial law generally," Archer said. "I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mr. Stone." Silas looked at Feld. His jaw moved slightly, the way it had moved in the saloon, the constant internal calculation of a man figuring angles. "Indentured contracts have a complex legal history in the territory," he said carefully. "Yes or no, Mr. Stone," Feld said. "Were you aware that the contract you held over Miss Turner was unenforceable under territorial law? I understood it was a legal document." "Your Honor?" Feld said, turning to Archer. "I'd like to introduce Exhibit 4, a letter from Mr. Stone's own attorney. A Mr. Gerald Holt of Wichita, dated March of 1873, advising Mr. Stone that contracts of this specific type were, and I quote, not legally enforceable under current territorial statute and carry significant risk of criminal liability if challenged." The room broke. Not loudly. It broke the way a rope breaks one moment, holding the next moment not. Prescott was on his feet. Silas was completely still, and the stillness was a different kind than the calculating stillness she'd seen before. This one had the quality of a man seeing the ground disappear from under him and not yet having fallen. "Your Honor, I object to the introduction of privileged attorney-client." "The privilege belongs to Mr. Stone," Feld said calmly. "Mr. Stone's former attorney, Mr. Holt, is a witness in this proceeding. He provided this letter voluntarily because Mr. Stone's use of his advice to continue in a legal practice falls outside the scope of privilege." He looked at Prescott. "Your Honor is welcome to review the applicable case law. I've provided citations." Archer looked at the letter. He looked at it for a long time. He looked at Silas Stone. "Mr. Stone," he said, and the formality in his voice had a new quality to it. "Were you advised that this type of contract was not enforceable?" Silas's jaw worked. "Yes or no," Archer said. The room held its breath. "I was advised there were questions," Silas said finally. It was the most careful way to say yes that Abigail had ever heard. Feld called her last. She walked to the stand, knowing that every eye in the room was on her, and that Prescott was going to be harder on her than he'd been on anyone else, because she was the one this whole thing was about, and breaking her testimony was his last real option. She sat down. She looked at Feld. He walked her through it. The debt, her father's death, the document, the first day, the 14 months. She gave him facts in order with the precision of someone who had been over this in her own mind so many times that it had become geography she knew by heart. She did not perform grief for the room. She didn't perform anything. She just said what had happened as plainly as she could and let it stand on its own. When Feld finished, Prescott stood up and buttoned his jacket and approached the stand with the careful deliberateness of a man who had decided on a strategy and was committing to it. "Miss Turner," he said, "you've characterized your time in Mr. Stone's employ as confinement. But you were provided room and board during that period, is that correct?" "I was provided a cot in a storage room and the food that was left after service," she said. "Yes." "You were given work." "I was given orders," she said. "There's a difference." Prescott shifted slightly. "You've testified that you never attempted to leave. If the arrangement was as oppressive as you've described, why didn't you simply— Because I had nowhere to go, she said. Because I was in a territory I didn't know, with no money, no family, and a document that I was told was legally binding. She kept her voice even. Because men like Mr. Stone are very good at making people believe they have no options. That's not an accident. That's the mechanism. Prescott looked at her. She could see him recalibrating. You're claiming Mr. Stone knew the contract was illegal, he said. Mr. Feld has already established that with documentary evidence, she said. I'm claiming that I was kept in a situation I couldn't legally be kept in for 14 months by a man who knew he had no legal right to keep me there, and who did it anyway because he calculated that I didn't have the means to find out. She paused. He was right about that for 14 months. He's not right anymore. The room was very quiet. Prescott looked at her for a moment. He sat down. Judge Archer called a recess of 30 minutes. Abigail sat in the hallway on a wooden bench and did not talk to anyone. Jonah sat beside her, close, but not touching, and that was exactly right. She needed the steadiness of him nearby, and she needed space to stay inside herself and not scatter. After about 10 minutes, he said, "You were extraordinary in there." She looked at the floor. "I just told the truth," she said. "Some people can't do that even when it's simple," he said. "It wasn't simple today." She looked at him. "Are you worried?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "About the case number, Feld's done everything right. Archer's a straight judge." He paused. "About what comes after a little." She understood what he meant. A judge's ruling closed a legal chapter. It didn't close Silas Stone, who would still be in Caldwell, still running the Dust Devil, still the kind of man he'd always been. "We'll handle what comes after when it comes," she said. He looked at her with that look again, the one she'd stopped trying to misread. "We?" he said. Not challenging it, just noting it. She held his gaze. "We," she said. They sat in the hallway until the door opened and Martin Feld looked out and said, "Judge is back." Archer read his ruling from the bench. He was methodical, which was the right way to do it. He went through the evidence in the order it had been presented, noting what it established, noting what it failed to establish, moving through it with the careful deliberateness of a man who intended his reasoning to be followed by anyone who read it later. The contract between Silas Stone and the Turner family, he ruled, had no legal standing under Kansas territorial law and never had. It was unenforceable and always had been. Any obligation Abigail Turner had believed herself to be under was based on a fraudulent document presented to her by a man who had been advised of its invalidity. The card game, he ruled, was a fair game. Jonah Cole had acquired a document with no legal value which he had subsequently declined to enforce, which was his right as holder of a worthless instrument. The complaint filed by Silas Stone, he ruled, was dismissed in its entirety. Furthermore, and here his voice took on a different quality, the quality of a man saying something he has decided must be said, he was referring the matter of the fraudulent contracts, including the pattern of behavior established by the testimony and exhibits presented to the Territorial Attorney General for review. The evidence suggested that Mr. Stone had engaged in a sustained practice of using legally invalid documents to confine individuals against their will, which constituted fraud at minimum and potentially other criminal violations. He looked at Silas Stone over the bench. "Mr. Stone," he said, "I'd advise you to consult counsel. Not Mr. Prescott, he's done what he could today. Consult different counsel, soon." Silas Stone sat perfectly still at his table. Prescott was writing something. Abigail sat with her hands folded in her lap and breathed. The gavel came down. It was over. Yet, not quite over. Because Silas Stone stood up from his table and turned and looked at her across the room, and the pleasant voice and the quiet voice were both gone now. What was left was something older and colder, the core of him stripped of the performance. "This isn't done," he said, directly to her, not loud, worse than loud. Jonah was on his feet before the words finished. "Silas," he said, "one word." Silas looked at him. "You think a judge's ruling changes anything?" Silas said. I've got more resources than your little ranch has seen in a decade. I'll bury this in appeals for years. And when she's tired of fighting." "She won't get tired," Jonah said. "And neither will I. You're going to spend everything you have defending a woman you won in a card game," Silas said. There was something almost bewildered in it under the anger. A man who genuinely could not understand what was motivating the person across from him. "Why? What is she to you?" The room was listening. Jonah didn't raise his voice. "She's family," he said. "And you don't touch my family." The word landed in the room like a stone in still water circles, spreading out from it in every direction, reaching every person present, meaning something different to each of them. To Abigail, sitting in her chair with her hands still folded, it hit somewhere behind her sternum and stayed there. Family. Not polite, not protective in the way of a man defending his property, not the careful maintenance of a reasonable arrangement. Family. Silas looked at Jonah for a long moment. Something moved through his calculating eyes, not defeat, not yet, but the recognition of a kind of obstacle he hadn't fully accounted for. A man who could be threatened with money, with lawyers, with time, but a man who had decided what he was standing for. Prescott put a hand on Silas's arm. Silas turned and walked out of the courtroom. The room exhaled. Feld gathered his papers with the quiet efficiency of a man satisfied with a day's work. Ruth Carver was crying in the back row silently with the expression of someone releasing something they'd held for years. Hank Mueller sat with his hands loose on his knees, and his head bowed slightly, the posture of a man who has done a hard thing and is recovering from the doing of it. Abigail stood up. She turned and looked at Jonah, who was still standing still watching the door Silas had gone through with the settled stillness of a man who has said what he meant and is at peace with having said it. He turned and found her looking at him. She didn't say anything right away. There were too many things, and none of them had the right shape for a courtroom. She reached out and put her hand on his arm just briefly. Just for a moment, in the way you touch something real when you need to confirm it's actually there. He put his hand over hers for just a moment. Then they both let go. "Let's go home," she said. It was the first time she'd called it that. He heard it. She knew he heard it from the way something changed in his face, eased, opened like a window that's been shut a long time and is finally let up. "Let's go home," he agreed. They walked out of the courthouse into the August heat, into the brightness that pressed down on Caldwell's main street without apology, into the town that had watched all of this and would now watch the aftermath of it, and neither of them walked small. She didn't have the habit of walking small anymore. That had been taken from her once. She wasn't going to give it back. Behind her she heard Webb's voice. He'd come into town after all, which surprised her, not at all, saying something to Hank Mueller that involved the words, "Drinks on me," and Hank's low laugh, and Doc Halley saying something about the heat. Ordinary sounds. The sounds of people coming out the other side of something hard. The wagon was where they'd left it. The horse patient in the heat. The road north waiting. She climbed up. Jonah climbed up beside her. He clicked to the horse. The wagon moved. The courthouse shrank behind them, and then was gone around a bend in the road, and ahead of them was the long, flat Kansas distance, and the heat and the sky that went on past the edge of caring about any one day's business. She was on the road north. She was going home. And this time, the word fit. The ride back from Caldwell was quiet, in the way that comes after something large has passed through a place and left it rearranged. Not empty quiet, full quiet, the kind that has weight and substance and doesn't need to be filled. Abigail sat on the wagon bench with her hands loose in her lap and felt the slow unwinding of something that had been coiled tight in her chest since before she could clearly remember. Since before the courthouse, before the ranch, before the saloon on the night of July 8th. Something that had been braced against impact for so long that the absence of impact felt almost like a new kind of pressure. It took her several miles to identify what she was feeling. Safe. Not fully, not permanently. Silas Stone was still in Caldwell, and the Territorial Attorney General's review was a process, not a conclusion, and the world did not reorganize itself overnight because a judge had ruled correctly for once. She knew all of that. But inside the perimeter of this wagon, on this road beside this man, she was safe. She turned that over quietly, the way you turn something fragile, checking it for cracks. It held. Jonah didn't say anything until they were about 4 miles out from town. Then he said, "Webb's going to have something on the stove by the time we get back. He cooks when he's anxious." "What does he make?" she asked. "Last time he was anxious, he made a pot of chili that fed us for 4 days," Jonah said. "Time before that, biscuits. About 40 of them." 40 biscuits, she said. "He doesn't do things by halves." She almost smiled. Then she did smile because she was done rationing them. "I like Webb," she said. "He likes you too," Jonah said. "He told me after the first week that I'd best not do anything foolish that would make you leave." He paused. That was his exact phrasing. She looked at him. "And what did you say?" "I told him I was doing my best," he said. "Simply without performance." She looked back at the road. Her best. Jonah Cole's best had been cold water brought to the garden in the July heat, and a paring knife re-edged without comment, and a wildflower in a jar on the kitchen windowsill. His best had been standing between her and every person who'd come to that ranch with the intention of undoing what he'd decided to do, and doing it without drama, without asking her to be grateful, without making her feel like a cause he'd taken on. His best had been saying family in that courtroom without hesitating. She understood now that she hadn't let herself absorb that word fully in the moment. She'd been managing too many things at once. Silas's face, the room's reaction, the sound of the gavel, the business of getting upright and walking out. She'd put it aside to deal with later. Later was now. She let it in. Family. The word moved through her, and she felt it settle somewhere so deep it stopped having a name. "Jonah," she said. "Yeah." "What you said to Silas." She kept her voice steady. "In the courtroom." He was quiet for a moment. "I meant it." "I know you did," she said. "That's what I'm sitting with." He looked at her sidelong. The afternoon light was starting to angle, dropping toward the flat western horizon, and it caught the side of his face and made him look like what he was, a man who'd been through weather and kept going, who'd buried things and kept working, who'd stood in a courthouse and said the most unadorned true thing he could say. "Is that a problem?" he asked. "No," she said. "It's the opposite of a problem." She paused. "I just haven't had someone say a thing like that in a long time. I'm relearning what it feels like." He nodded once, looked back at the road. "Take whatever time you need," he said. She did. Webb had made chili, an enormous amount of it. The smell hit them before they even got through the door, and Abigail laughed a real one, full, not the careful kind, and Jonah made a sound behind her that was something between a sigh and amusement. Webb appeared from the kitchen with a wooden spoon, and absolutely no shame about the quantity of food he had produced. "Well," he said. "Dismissed," Jonah said. "All of it." Webb closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he opened them and pointed the spoon at Abigail. "You. Sit down. You're eating before you do anything else." "Yes, sir," she said. She sat. Webb served them both with the authority of a man who had decided that care was best expressed through portion sizes, and Abigail ate because she was hungry, and because the food was good, and because sitting in this kitchen that smelled like wood smoke and chili and old timber at this table, where she'd eaten every meal for 5 weeks, felt like an answer to a question she'd been asking for a very long time. Halfway through the meal, Webb said without looking up from his own bowl, "Silas going to make more trouble?" "Probably," Jonah said. "We ready for it?" "We are," Jonah said. Webb nodded, ate another spoonful. "Good enough then." That was Webb's version of a celebration, and Abigail understood it was a generous one. 3 days after the hearing, the first letter came from the Territorial Attorney General's office. Feld sent a note with it, brief, professional, with a warmth underneath the professional language that hadn't been there at their first meeting. The letter confirmed that a formal review of Silas Stone's business practices had been opened. It listed the evidence submitted. It asked for Abigail's availability for a follow-up deposition. She read it at the kitchen table. Then she read it again. The review meant Silas wasn't just fighting a civil case anymore. He was fighting the territory. His resources were considerable, but they weren't infinite. And more importantly, his power in Caldwell had always depended on people believing he was untouchable. A territorial investigation made that harder to believe. She wrote back to Feld the same day confirming her availability. She wrote clearly and specifically, and signed her name the way she'd been signing things since she was a child. Abigail Grace Turner, all three names, because her mother had told her once that a woman who signs her full name is a woman who takes up her full space. She'd stopped signing her full name somewhere in the first month at the Dust Devil. She wasn't going to stop again. The second thing that happened that week was smaller and larger at the same time. She was in the garden on a Thursday afternoon working on the bean rows that had finally come in properly when she heard Jonah's boots on the dry ground behind her. She'd gotten good at his footsteps. She knew the difference between the working walk and the coming to find you walk. This was the second one. She sat back on her heels and looked up. He was holding something, a packet of seeds, paper-wrapped, tied with a short length of twine. "Came in on the supply wagon," he said. He held it out. She took it, looked at the writing on the outside. Rose seeds. A specific variety. She didn't recognize the name, but it was written in the careful hand of someone who'd ordered them deliberately. She looked up at him. "I wrote to a nursery in St. Louis 3 weeks ago," he said. "They said these would establish in the first year if you get them in before September." She was very still. "Jonah," she said. "The rose bush at the end isn't going to last another winter," he said. His voice was practical, which was how he covered the things that weren't practical at all. "It's too old. But if you get these started before the heat breaks—" "Jonah," she said again. He stopped. She was looking at the seed packet in her hands, and she was not going to cry in the garden in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. She'd decided that before the thought fully formed, but something in her chest had come loose in the way of things that have been tied down too long. He crouched down to her level without being asked. Which was the right move, and which she suspected he knew was the right move, because Jonah Cole had a way of reading what people needed that he never announced, but never failed at. "She said every place needs something that isn't useful," he said quietly. "I know," Abigail said. "You told me." "I think she was right," he said. "I think this place has been missing it." She looked at him. Up close at this angle in the afternoon light, the lines at the corners of his eyes, the weathered patience of his face, the eyes that were steadier than almost anything she'd encountered in her life. "Thank you," she said. "Put them in the south end," he said. "Better drainage." He stood up. He went back to what he'd been doing. She sat in the garden for a long moment, with rose seeds in her hands, and the Kansas sun pressing warm on the back of her neck, and she let herself feel it, all of it, the full weight of what this place had become to her. What he had become to her, without pulling back from it, or qualifying it, or waiting to see if it was safe. It was safe. That was the thing she'd been learning for 5 weeks, and had just now finished learning. It was safe. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived on a Friday evening 2 weeks after the hearing in the form of a writer from Caldwell with a sealed letter addressed to Jonah Cole. Webb took it at the gate and brought it inside, and his face was doing the careful thing again that meant he'd already formed an opinion about what was in it. Jonah opened it at the supper table. He read it. He set it down. He picked it up and read it again. "What?" Abigail said. He looked up at her. "Silas is leaving Caldwell." She went still. "The Territorial Review," Jonah said. "And apparently 2 other women have come forward since Ruth Carver. The Attorney General's office has widened the investigation. Prescott apparently told Silas that fighting it was going to cost more than the Dust Devil was worth, and take long enough to be public enough to destroy what was left of his standing." He put the letter on the table. "He's selling the saloon. He's leaving the territory." Silence. Webb said, "Huh," in the tone of a man receiving better news than he'd anticipated. Abigail looked at the letter on the table. She didn't pick it up. She'd spent 14 months afraid of Silas Stone. Not the theatrical afraid of nightmares, but the practical afraid of someone who has real power over your real life. The kind that makes you small and quiet and careful. Because small and quiet and careful are survival strategies. She'd spent 5 weeks learning to undo that, and she wasn't done undoing it. And she understood that a man leaving a territory didn't automatically leave a person's nervous system. But he was leaving. The 2 other women, she said. Do you know who they are? Letter doesn't say, Jonah said. I want to know, she said. I want to make sure they have what they need. Feld's contact, whatever helped us. Jonah looked at her. I'll write to Feld tomorrow, he said. Tonight, she said. A pause. Then, tonight. He agreed. Webb stood up and started clearing plates, and his back was to them when he said, I've been in this territory 20 years. I've seen men like Silas Stone before. They leave one place and they set up somewhere else. Territory doesn't run out of room for them. He set the plates by the washstand and turned around. But they don't get to run the same game twice in the same place. That's something. It's not enough, Abigail said. No, Webb said. But it's a start. And starts are what you've got until they turn into more. She looked at him. Webb Daniels, who had handed her cold water in the yard on her first morning and shown her the cross breeze from the south side of the house, and told her about Clara in the barn with Amos shifting beside them. Who had made 40 biscuits when he was anxious and shown up at the courthouse when he'd been told to stay at the ranch. Thank you, Webb, she said. He looked surprised. Then gruff, which was his way of handling being touched. For what? He said. For being here, she said. All of it. He picked up the plates again and turned back to the washstand without answering, but she could see the set of his shoulders change. Well, that night, Jonah wrote to Feld. She watched him do it from across the kitchen table, the close, careful handwriting, the way he worked through what he wanted to say with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. He wasn't a man who threw words around. When he wrote something down, it meant what it said. When he finished, he handed it to her. She read it. He'd asked for the names of the other women. He'd asked for their contact information if they were willing. He'd offered the use of Feld's services at his own expense for any legal needs they had arising from the investigation. He'd said in the plain language of a man saying exactly what he means. No one who Silas Stone used this way ought to navigate what comes next alone. She set the letter down. She looked at him. You're a good man, she said. Not with the careful delivery of someone paying a considered compliment. Just the truth said plainly the way he said things. He looked back at her. I'm trying to be, he said. Some days are easier than others. The days I've seen, she said. You're doing fine. He held her gaze for a moment that was longer than the usual kind. Then he folded the letter and set it with his other correspondence to go out in the morning and got up to bank the stove for the night. September came in gently, which was not always Kansas's habit. The heat dropped by degrees, not all at once, but gradually the way it does when summer is ready to let go without making a scene about it. The mornings got their edges back. The evenings had something approaching cool in them. Abigail's rose seeds were in the ground at the south end of the garden, the old rose bush at the far end. Clara's rose bush, the one that had been losing its argument with the dry ground since before Abigail arrived, had 2 more buds on it now, small and red and absolutely determined. She'd been watering it daily and talking to it occasionally, which she'd have denied if asked, but which Webb had witnessed twice and said nothing about. She was in the garden on a Saturday morning in the second week of September when Jonah came out and stood at the edge of it and watched her for a moment. Got a letter from my sister, he said. She's coming through in October. Wants to meet you. Abigail sat up. Your sister? Margaret. She's in Topeka. She'd heard some of what happened and she... He stopped, started over. She wants to meet you because I wrote to her about you. Something in the air changed. You wrote to her about me, Abigail said. After the hearing, he said. He wasn't moving, wasn't elaborating. Just standing there with the early September light on him, and his hat in his hand, and the patient expression of a man who has said something real and is letting it be real. I told her what had happened. I told her you were... He stopped again. She waited. "I told her you were staying," he said, "if you wanted to. And I told her she should come and see for herself what kind of person you were." A pause. "Because I had opinions about that, and I knew she'd want to form her own." Abigail looked at him. "What are your opinions?" she said. He met her eyes. "That you're the most capable, honest, and courageous person I've had in this house," he said. "And that this house is better with you in it, and that I'd like it to stay that way." Another pause, shorter. "If that's what you want." Her heart was doing the thing again, the thing she'd stopped trying to manage or minimize. "Jonah," she said, "you need to say what you're saying." He looked at her steadily. "I know." "Then say it." He took a breath. "I'm not asking you to stay out of obligation," he said. "I'm not asking you to stay because of the arrangement, or because of Silas, or because you haven't got anywhere else to go. You've got places you could go. You could go anywhere you wanted to at this point and do well." He paused. "I'm asking you to stay because I want you here. Because this is the first time in 2 years that this place has felt like a home again. Because you know where everything is in this kitchen, and you talked to the rosebush, and you corrected my ledger, and you convinced Hank Mueller to do the right thing in one conversation." He stopped. "Because I think about you when you're not in the room." The garden was very quiet. She stood up. She was a tall woman, and standing put her close to eye level with him, which was where she wanted to be for this. "I stopped planning to leave after the second week," she said. "I didn't tell you because I didn't know what I was staying for yet. I needed to understand it myself first." "And now," he said, "now I understand it," she said. "It's you, Jonah. It's this place and Webb and the rosebush and the ledger and all of it, but it's you." He looked at her. She looked at him. "I'd like to meet your sister," she said. Something happened to his face that she hadn't seen before. A kind of undoing, gentle and total, the expression of a man who has been holding himself together for a very long time and has just been given permission to stop. He reached out and took her hand. Not a grand gesture. Not a declaration designed for an audience. Just a man taking a woman's hand in a garden in September in the simple, serious way of people who mean what they do. She held on. Margaret Cole arrived on the 14th of October on the afternoon coach from Topeka with 3 pieces of luggage and the kind of personality that announced itself before she cleared the door. She was Jonah's age, with the same steady eyes and a warmth that he kept at a lower volume. She looked at Abigail for about 3 seconds when they were introduced, and then she looked at her brother, and whatever she saw in both of those looks seemed to settle something for her. "Well," she said to Jonah, "you were right." "About what?" he said. "About her," Margaret said. She looked back at Abigail. "He said you were the most remarkable woman he'd encountered since Clara. I told him he was exaggerating because he's not good at feelings, and people who aren't good at feelings overcorrect when they finally have them." She extended her hand to Abigail. "I was wrong. He was under-exaggerating." Abigail shook her hand. "He said you'd form your own opinion," Abigail said. "And I have," Margaret said. 30 seconds in, "I'm fast." Jonah said, "Lord help me," in the tone of a man who loves his sister and is exhausted by her simultaneously. That evening, the 4 of them, Jonah and Abigail and Margaret and Webb, who had been absorbed into Margaret's orbit with the resigned dignity of a man who knows when he's outmatched, sat around the kitchen table and ate and talked in the way of people who fit together without having to work at it. Margaret told stories about Jonah that Abigail filed carefully for future use. Webb contributed too that he'd been holding apparently for exactly this occasion. Jonah sat with the expression of a man willing to pay this tax because the thing being built around the table was worth it. Abigail laughed more that evening than she had in years. Real laughter, the kind that comes from a room being genuinely alive. When the dishes were done, and Webb had gone to the bunkhouse, and Margaret had gone to the guest room. Abigail's old room, because Abigail had moved her things to the larger room down the hall 3 weeks ago. In the quiet way of things that had arranged themselves, Without announcement, Jonah and Abigail ended up on the front porch again. The October night was cool, not cold, but carrying the first real suggestion of what was coming. The stars were the sharp kind that only appear when the air has dried out and cleaned itself. "She likes you," Jonah said. "I like her," Abigail said. "She's terrifying." "Yes," he said. "She's been terrifying since she was about 6 years old." Abigail pulled her shawl tighter. Jonah stood up from his chair, went inside, came back with a heavier blanket and put it around her shoulders, the way someone does when they've stopped asking permission for small acts of care. She looked up at him. He sat back down. "Jonah," she said. "Yeah. I need to tell you something." He looked at her patient. "When you stood up in that courtroom and said what you said," she began, "I understood it in a factual way in the moment. But I've been living with it for 2 months now, and I want you to know what it actually meant." She paused, organized the words. "No one had called me family since my father died. I'd stopped expecting anyone to. I'd gotten to a place where I was managing what I had my own 2 hands, my own wits, and telling myself that was enough, and mostly believing it." "Abigail, let me finish," she said, gently. "I'd gotten good at being alone because I thought alone was the only option I had. And then you sat down in a saloon and called a hand you shouldn't statistically have won and crossed the room and handed me a piece of paper, and I still don't entirely understand why." "Because it was right," he said. The same answer he'd given before. "I know," she said. "But here's what I want you to know. It wasn't just the paper. It wasn't even the ruling or the lawyer or any of it." She turned and looked at him directly. "It was every morning. Every time you put water somewhere I could reach it and walked away. Every time you didn't ask me to be grateful. Every time you said no argument from me." She paused. "You gave me back something I didn't know I could get back." He was looking at her with the full attention of someone who is hearing something important and intends to. "What did I give back?" he said quietly. "The idea that I was worth something," she said. "Not useful worth something. Those aren't the same thing. I knew I was useful. I'd always been useful. But you—" She stopped. "You looked at me like I was worth something. From the first night. Like it was obvious. Like it wasn't even a question." His jaw worked. "It wasn't a question," he said. "It was never a question." She looked at him. This man who had lost his wife and kept his ranch and kept going in the stubborn, quiet way of a person who has decided that forward is the only useful direction. Who had written to a nursery in St. Louis for rose seeds and said every place needs something that isn't useful and meant both things at once. "I love you," she said. She'd decided to say it plainly the way you say the thing you mean when you are done managing the distance between what you feel and what you say. He was very still for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand the same way he had in the garden, the same simple and serious way, and said, "I've been in love with you since you corrected my ledger." She stared at him. "The ledger," she said. "It told me everything I needed to know about you," he said. "You'd been in that house for 4 days. You could have left those errors alone. Nobody would have known. But you found them corrected, them explained the corrections, and left it on the table without saying a word about it." He paused. "That's the kind of person you are. You do the right thing when no one's watching." She was quiet for a long moment. "That is possibly the most unusual reason anyone has ever given," she said. "I'm not a usual man," he said. "No," she agreed. "You are absolutely not." He lifted her hand and held it in both of his for a moment, warm, calloused, careful. "Stay," he said. "I'm staying," she said. "I already stayed. That's been decided." He almost smiled. She smiled for him. The weeks that followed were the kind that build a life. Not dramatic weeks. Not the weeks of courtrooms and letters and riders at the gate. The ordinary weeks of 2 people learning the shape of each other, filling in the details, making the small adjustments that turn proximity into partnership and partnership into something with deeper roots. She took over the books completely, which Jonah accepted with the relief of a man who'd been doing something he wasn't good at for longer than was necessary. She started corresponding with the two other women from the Attorney General's investigation. They were not in Caldwell. Silas had ranged further than any of them had known, and she put them in contact with Feld and with each other, because the worst thing about Silas Stone's method had always been the isolation, and she was done allowing that to work. The rose seeds broke ground in late October, which the nursery had said was possible, but not guaranteed. She knelt in the garden in the thin autumn light and looked at the small green fact of them pushing up through the dark soil and felt something wordless and complete move through her. Jonah crouched beside her. "There they are," he said. "There they are," she said. He put his hand on her back, warm, steady, right there, and they stayed like that for a moment in the October garden. Shashka. Margaret stayed 2 weeks. When she left, she embraced Abigail at the gate with the full conviction of a woman who has decided something and is acting on it. "You're good for him," she said, into Abigail's ear low. "And I think he's good for you." "He is," Abigail said. "Don't let him get quiet for too long," Margaret said. "He goes inside himself when things get hard and forgets to come back out. You're going to need to go in and get him sometimes." "I know," Abigail said. "I've been doing that." Margaret pulled back and looked at her. "Yes," she said. "I can see that you have." She climbed into the coach. Webb and Jonah both watched it go. Then Webb said, "Thank God," in a tone of profound relief, and went back to the barn, and Jonah turned to Abigail with the look of a man who had reached the end of a long road and found it was better than he'd expected. "She means well," he said. "She's wonderful," Abigail said. "She exhausts me." "She exhausts everyone," Abigail said. "That's how you know she's doing it right." He laughed, full and real, the way she'd been hearing more of since summer ended, a sound that had been gone from this place for 2 years and had come back without announcement the way the best things do. She laughed with him. They stood in the yard in October in the good light and laughed together, and it was the most ordinary and extraordinary thing in the world. The last letter from the Territorial Attorney General's office arrived in November. Silas Stone had reached a settlement with the territory. The specific terms were listed in careful legal language. He had paid restitution to each of the women named in the investigation. He had surrendered his business license in Kansas Territory. He had left for parts east, and was Feld added in his own note at the bottom of the official communication, unlikely to find the same operation easy to establish in a territory that now had his name on record. It wasn't justice in the full sense. She knew that. There was no version of legal proceedings that gave back 14 months, or what they'd cost, or what it felt like to be in a storage room in a July that never cooled. But it was something solid and real that had been done by her own hands and her own voice and the people who had stood beside her. And the two women whose names she now knew, Mary and Catherine, in 2 different counties, were not alone in navigating it. She folded the letter. She set it on the kitchen table. Jonah read it. He set it down. "Is that enough?" he said. He wasn't asking if she was satisfied. He was asking if she was all right. "No," she said. "But it's a start, and starts are what you've got until they turn into more." She looked at him. "Webb said that." "He says smart things when you're not expecting it," Jonah said. "Yes," she said. "He does." She picked up the letter and put it in the box she kept on the shelf. Not a hidden box, not a box she was ashamed of. A record. Her record of what had happened and what she'd done about it and how it had ended. She would not forget what was in it. But she would also not live inside it. That was the line she'd found in September and held on to between remembering and being trapped. Between honoring what had happened and letting it close her off from what was happening now. What was happening now was this: a ranch in Kansas in November, with the first real cold coming in under the doors and the smell of wood smoke, and a man in the other room reading by the lamp in the chair that faced west, and Webb in the bunkhouse, probably already asleep, and rose seedlings in the south end of the garden that had survived the first frost and would the nursery had promised bloom come May. What was happening now was her life, the one that was hers, not assigned, not contracted, not one in a card game. Hers because she had fought for it and stayed for it and chosen it. She walked into the main room. Jonah looked up from his book. She sat in the chair beside his, the one that had become her chair, the way things become yours when you stop waiting for permission to let them, and picked up the book she'd left there that morning. And the lamp between them gave off the kind of steady light that makes a room feel like the center of something. And outside, the Kansas night pressed down dark and cold and enormous in the way of things that are indifferent to what happens inside particular houses. Inside this